We ended the last lecture module by outlining the underlying rationale, the goal, and the methodologies of 20th century analytic philosophy. In this module, we want to turn our attention to how it is that Weinberg, Nichols, and Stich understand that 20th century analytic philosophy and how they want to respond to it in the context of their own paper. Weinberg, Nichols, and Stich also question this story. They label the view intuition-driven romanticism, or IDR for short. As they characterize intuition-driven romanticism, it involves at least three aspects. The strategy has to take epistemic intuitions as data or inputs. It must produce as outputs explicit or implicit normative claims. Now, they distinguish between explicit normative claims, which are generally methodological claims about how we ought to go about forming beliefs. Implicit claims can include these sorts of claims, but they also include what we identify as the major emphasis in epistemology, claims about how certain doxatic structures amount to real knowledge. Finally, the third element of intuition-driven romanticism for this group is that the output of a strategy must depend, at least in part, on the intuitions that it takes as input, so that if intuitions vary, the output would also vary. In addition to this, they would claim that my characterization runs together what they would distinguish between what they call normative and descriptive versions of the project. They follow Richard Samuels and discuss four different types of the project that fall under this general theoretic umbrella. However, the major distinction is between the normative project and the descriptive project. The evaluative project and the ameliorative project are actually part of or related to the normative project. The normative project, which they think is the most philosophically central, attempts to establish norms that are going to guide our epistemic activities. Some norms might be explicitly regulative in nature, specifying ways in which we should go about engaging in our epistemic activities. Others are implicit and provide guidance as to goals or methodologies without explicitly providing norms. Within that normative project, then, there are two related projects. The evaluative project tries to assess how well or poorly people's actual belief-forming practices accord with the norms that are specified within the normative project. The ameliorative project presupposes that we don't come out with the highest possible score in that evaluative project. As a result, they ask how we can go about improving, ameliorating our deficiencies in response to our inadequacies as diagnosed in the normative and evaluative projects. Now, these projects are contrasted with the descriptive project. When concepts are the target, the goal is to describe or to analyze concepts that some group of people actually invoke. The idea here is that when concepts are the target, we're trying to describe conceptual structure inherent in people's conceptual behavior. When language is the target, we're trying to describe the way in which some group of people use that epistemic language, analyzing the meanings of those epistemic terms. Though they distinguish between these four different types of projects that fall under the general IDR rubric, they are nevertheless sympathetic to the presentation of analytic epistemology that I gave in the first lecture module, precisely because, like me, they suspect that many philosophers see the descriptive and normative projects as deeply related. Their goal in the paper is to test the story's implications through empirical experimentation. Specifically, they're going to formulate four hypotheses about the nature of people's intuitions regarding some classic thought experiments from the epistemological literature. Experimental confirmation of their hypotheses is going to provide prima facie evidence against the basic presuppositions of analytic philosophy as commonly practiced. Specifically, they want to seek empirical support for what they call the normativity problem. That is, they want to find empirical evidence that supports their denial of the claim that the output of one or another of these intuition-driven romantic strategies has real normative force as opposed to mere putative normative force. The first hypothesis that they formulate is that epistemic intuitions vary from culture to culture. Analytic epistemology, or what they call intuition-driven romanticism, assumes that our concepts of knowledge and justification provide us with the one true set of epistemic norms. If intuitions have this property, then people's intuitions about philosophical cases shouldn't vary from culture to culture because those intuitions all reflect the same one true set of epistemic norms. The second hypothesis is that intuitions vary from one socio-economic group to another. Again, if analytic epistemologists correctly hold intuition-driven romanticism, one would expect that there's very little variation in epistemic intuitions from one socio-economic group to another, precisely because those intuitions reflect a commonly held view about the nature of knowledge. After all, knowledge isn't going to be discriminating between rich and poor in these cases. The third hypothesis asserts that intuitions vary as a function of how many philosophy courses a person has taken. Like other differences between groups, divergent intuitions based upon the number of philosophy courses taken would undermine the idea of a universal set of norms had by all people regarding these epistemic concepts. It would also suggest that experience shapes intuitions in ways that might undermine the power of agreement amongst philosophers with regard to their intuitions on these cases. The fourth and final hypothesis is that intuitions depend in part on the order in which the cases are presented. If intuition-driven romanticism correctly supposes that epistemic intuitions are driven by epistemic norms that are universally held by all individuals, then people's intuitive verdicts regarding a given philosophical thought experiment shouldn't vary as a result of variable and accidental factors such as what order the thought experiments came in. In the next lecture module, we'll turn our attention to the data presented by Weinberg, Nichols, and Stich in this paper for the first and second hypotheses, after which we'll consider the objections that they mention together with their replies to those objections.